Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Franco Nuschese, and I'm just one of the co-hosts, Tammy, Hilary Rosen, and Kathy. So I wanted to thank you for all of you to join us today. This is a really unique and special day. Cafe Milano has always been a place where people can gather and discuss the important issue of the day in a safe place. And Cafe Milano has been fostering discussion like this for pretty much the last 25 years. And now I'm proud that we can continue that tradition with everyone gathered here today. I wanted to thank Ronan Farrow for sharing such a special day with us in a very busy schedule. Congratulations on your winning of the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, and of course on your new book, War on Peace. We are all very proud of you. And thanks for mentioning Cafe Milano.
Thank you so much.
I want you to know that we have some other Pulitzer winner here today. There's Jane Meyer, also Pulitzer, so that she can welcome you. She can definitely join you to welcome to the club. And now let's raise a glass to the great work of this journalist and all the other journalists in this room, because we have quite a few of them, a lot of familiar faces. Cheers. And now let me pass the microphone to Kathy.
So, thank you, sir. So I'm going to add just a quick little toast because I was lucky enough to be Ronan's producer for 2 years, and
She put up with me for 2 years.
I did. It was good work though. So I saw pretty immediately early on and was dazzled by his brilliance and his extraordinary raw talent. But even I couldn't begin to predict the speed and the power of his reporting and how it was kind of a jet fuel for the moment, creating a cultural shift, a massive cultural shift in our country that happened, unfolded in real time, as we all witnessed. And so now this additional gripping work to document and to understand what's going on with American diplomacy. And it is, again, hitting at exactly the right moment. The timing, voila. I mean, the timing was genius and perfect. And once again, a brave and thoughtful voice speaking truth to power. So congrats, my friend.
Thank you, Kathy.
And now Tammy, the amazing Tammy Haddad, is going to do a quick interview with Sir Ronan Farrow.
Thank you to Cafe Milano. It's a thrill to be here, and I'm so grateful to Hilary and Kathy and Tammy, my dear friends, and you had far better things to do, and you guys are, as I said, the best producers in the land. So
thank you. I'll take it all.
thank you for producing this.
I want to start out with the fact that you're so brave in this book. I mean, first of all, you took on all of these institutions. You are taking on the entire diplomatic corps. You're taking on the military establishment. You're telling all of us that we need to look at diplomacy completely differently. That's really pretty amazing, pretty gutsy.
Thank you, Tammy. You know, I mean, just to button up the point about a community like this and places like this and conversations like this, there's a moment in the book where I talk about Richard Holbrooke, who was my mentor of many years and a friend to many people in this room, you know, setting meetings at prominent places around DC, wanting to be seen and send a message about his legitimacy in a job, which was part of his, you know, his brio for years and years and years. This was part of the performance, and I talk about how the times had just changed by the end and how there wasn't really an audience to receive that message anymore. So, you know, it's a very small sliver of the stuff I'm talking about in the book, but it is part of the fabric of it.
It's the same larger point, where you've got these incredible experts who work really hard, whether you're talking about Henry Kissinger or Richard Holbrooke. My favorite story in that is that Caddy Martin, who many in the room know, told him, people can't call you Dick anymore, you have to be called Richard, right? And then when he goes to meet with President Obama, which was sort of a controversial thing, should he come in, should he come out, the first thing President Obama says is, "Hi, Dick," and he corrects him, right? And he said, "No, it's Richard."
Yeah,
right?
President Obama did not like Dick Holbrooke at all. And, you know, there was the personal dislike by all accounts around that circle of people. But then also there was a systemic change happening of just we don't let as many diplomats in the room anymore. And There's astonishing candor from a lot of Obama administration officials in this book. Ben Rhodes saying, we were snowed by a culture of celebrity generals, is the phrase he uses. And he says, we had to course correct in that second term because of it.
Okay, so here's my question for you about that. I just sort of felt like that is the result of being a Democratic administration. I view in political terms that Democratic presidents are afraid of the military establishment. So they put all these generals in because they thought it kind of worked better, and they were getting input as opposed to generals who tend to be more conservative, that maybe are more negative. I mean, I always thought that was sort of a political point, but they all talk to you. How did you get them all to talk to you, including Rex Tillerson?
Yeah, all of the living former secretaries of state. I think, honestly, they spoke for this book because it's a point of passion for every last one of them. These are individuals with complicated and controversial track records, but they all earnestly wanted to make American diplomacy stronger in their way. I think even in a profoundly misguided and chaotic way, probably Rex Tillerson when he came into the job. And I'm very grateful that they all were extraordinarily candid in different ways. You have Colin Powell on the record in this book saying, we're ripping the guts out of the State Department. The Trump administration is mortgaging your future. I mean, really just going balls to the wall here.
Right, and they're quoted directly, too.
Yeah, people went on the record for this and saying some pretty frank things, and I'm grateful for it.
I love the little anecdote about Colin Powell saying he never said the Pottery Barn rule. Do you know he actually never said it? He
never used the phrase. He
Right.
did allude to the concept of, like, you break it, you keep it.
Right.
Although we both broke and did not keep Iraq, so.
So let's go back to politics, because part of your argument is since 9/11, that diplomacy has declined, and it's always been a trend more to military. Again, is that political? Is that about domestic politics, and that's how we ended up with someone like President Trump? Or is it just, look, it's easier, it's terrible to say it this way, is it easier to, send a drone in and bomb folks than to try to negotiate for 25 years, some sort of nuclear deal?
It's both about expedient politics domestically and about changing circumstances in the world. Condoleezza Rice and several other former secretaries point out in this book, we're in a state of emergency. Of course things are tilting towards the military to some extent. But even she questioned the full extent of the cuts and the purging of State Department staff. And I think there was a lot of concern about the extent of the imbalance. Madeleine Albright talks about, yes, there being an inevitable size difference. The Pentagon has to be larger for various logistical reasons. We need military might. Richard Holbrooke would have been one of the first to say we need military might. He used the threat of NATO strikes to get that Dayton Peace Accord. But what Albright says is, it doesn't have to be this imbalanced. And I think that's the prevailing opinion. And that does flow from both, I think, our being so accustomed to a state of emergency that we don't know anything else anymore. The vicious cycle of these cuts and this decapitation of American diplomacy, if you want to build a well in Afghanistan, you have to do it through the Pentagon. Because if you do it through USAID, there's a multiple-year process of requests for applications, and then they bring in a big beltway contractor, and they subcontract 3 times, and there's no expertise in-house to guide it, so you end up drilling the well in a place where the groundwater is too salty anyway, no one can use it. This is like the classic boondoggle, and the answer to that is not we should throw out USAID and state. It's we need to re-empower them in an intelligent way, which
wait a minute, you're
we've
sounding
done before
like
in
Donald
history.
Trump. Here, let's get rid of USAID. I mean, isn't that part of what they're saying? Do you worry that you're empowering them a little? I mean, are you worried about a tweet from the president right now saying, even Ronan Farrow agrees we shouldn't spend this money overseas?
Well, it'd be great for sales, so I hope he does.
You're already number 3.
But no, I think I'm very careful to draw the distinction. There is a difference between a need for reform and a need to obliterate. And what I think every credible voice in this book agrees on is we are not reforming sensibly. We are cutting into muscle, not fat. And we are doing it in a way where it's going to take years and years and years to come back, if we ever do. Because bear in mind, we're not just hobbling our ability to keep Americans safe, because of course it's the career officers on the ground screening dangerous people from coming into this country, to make the deals that can keep our brave servicemen and women out of the line of fire. we're not just doing that in the here and now, Tammy. We're drying up the flow of talent into the Foreign Service. We are removing its prestige. Numbers are at an all-time low. No one is going into this profession. And that's going to mean that we don't have the ambassadors that should already be in the pipeline to assume those positions in 10 years, in 20 years.
Well, you open up on crazy name, Countryman, right?
Tom Countryman.
Tom Countryman, and you should tell his story because it makes you sick if you believe in government and the power that the U.S. government has around the country. You should tell the story.
I thought he was a great example of what's going on at the State Department right now because in the very first days of the Trump administration, he was one of the many, many career officers to just get unceremoniously shown the door. And he, in particular, is a sad story because he was our top official on arms control at the State Department, which is a professed priority for this administration. And obviously we're looking at the looming challenges related to the Iran deal and to North Korea. And yet we just got rid of the guy who was perhaps best equipped to confront those challenges, like that. And he's also a great example, I think, of what makes this profession so misunderstood and so vital. He served all around the world for decades and decades, moving his family around, uprooting his life for very little pay, often in very dangerous places. He was in a bunch of different war zones. He traveled so much and did so much training as a diplomat that he speaks, a zillion different languages and has an amalgamated accent that sounds like all of them that I think I describe as sounding like a text-to-speech application or a Bond villain. Mm-hmm. And he gets a lot of flack, there's online trolls saying, oh, look at this dusty bureaucrat. But I try to explain how important his work is to making our country safer. And
what's he
what
doing
a loss
now?
It is. I think he's retired now. This is the other travesty. We are not going to see these people come back in if we get better leadership. For some of these people, like Tom Countryman, that's it. That was the end of his career.
Rex Tillerson, can you talk about that interview? Because it was shockingly candid, or it seems like.
Shockingly candid, yeah, and I'm really
And
grateful.
when was it? When did you do that? Had he left already?
No, it was right before he was fired. So it's one of his last interviews in the job, and I think for sure his most transparent. And what's interesting is in this interview, he for the first time admits that maybe he just lacked the experience necessary, which is a pretty striking admission. He says, when I started defending these deep cuts to the State Department, I was only in the job for a couple months, and I didn't know how budget advocacy worked on the Hill, and I thought you could just go to Congress and say, no, keep your money, don't give me money, cut this department down to size. And obviously every other Secretary of State I spoke to expressed some degree of astonishment at that idea.
Right, well, they tried to talk to him. It's not as if he just didn't want to listen to anyone.
Well, he wouldn't take Condoleezza Rice's calls, and she was one of his biggest backers. They have an okay relationship, but there was a real problem that accreted around him where he was in a fortress. And he had this, by all accounts, very, very controlling chief of staff who just firewalled him from the rest of the government.
The chief of staff is unbelievable. She's one that knocked down all the walls, right? And said, we're going to make it like Bloomberg, which I work for Bloomberg, and that's usually a good thing, right? But didn't she knock down all the walls so all the diplomats couldn't speak confidentially?
She did a lot of things that made it into some of the fine outlets represented in this room. I think there were a couple of Washington Post pieces that had some colorful doozies, like allegedly her ordering people not to make eye contact with him, which I could never shore up whether that was real. But this was the kind of word that was going around. He came into the State Department, proceeded to ignore the men and women of the State Department, and then went out to Congress and said, destroy this place.
And what about Mike Pompeo? Have you talked to him? What do you think of him? And also, just as someone who's been in this town a long time, what are the optics globally of having the former CIA chief now being in charge of diplomacy?
Well, I think time will tell. Mike Pompeo inspires a lot of fear right now amongst the many whistleblowers from the State Department in this book. He's obviously extremely hawkish, and the combination of him and John Bolton being in the conversation inspires some fear because these are voices who have been very much against a more diplomatic peacemaking apparatus. He has matched the president, tweet for saber-rattling tweet about Iran and trying to roll back some of the recent diplomatic accomplishments in our history. And people don't necessarily see him as a natural fit for the job that is so desperately needed right now, which is someone who brings really robust leadership and embraces the importance of this work.
And what about House Republicans or any Republicans members on the Hill? Did you talk to any of them? Did any of them seem to have the concerns that you have? Is there any sort of coalition forming?
Very much so. So this is maybe a small ray of hope in all of your days interacting with or covering just how divisive and partisan things are. This is a rare bipartisan issue. This does not hew to any clear party lines. If you look at the pushback that ultimately transpired on the Hill, the congressmen and women saying, actually, hold on a second, we're not going to slash American diplomacy to ribbons, that was pretty equal representation from both parties. It was people like Corker saying, I'm throwing this budget out.
Yeah, but Corker's leaving.
Yeah, well, Lindsey Graham also was hopping mad by all accounts about the Tillerson business. There was one prominent member of the Republican leadership on the Hill that actually called the White House and threatened to subpoena Rex Tillerson. They were so mad. So yeah, there was decent pushback from the right side of the aisle.
And what has been the reaction to the book? I mean, has anyone lined up, called you and said, okay, we're going to help you do this? Because you're making specific recommendations on how to change all this.
I'm so glad you picked up on that, because I get asked a lot, like, is it the death of diplomacy? And there's a reason that's not the title. I think that I wouldn't have bothered writing this book if I thought it was a eulogy. The whole back half of it, while it comes after some very, I hope, unflinching portrayals of just how grave the problems are, the back half of this book is devoted to looking at our history for lessons about how you turn this stuff around. And I think there are some very clear examples. I think going back to what Ben Rhodes said, as much as I'm pretty brutal about the mistakes of the Obama administration, including some I saw firsthand.
Was he brutal about his own mistakes? I'm just asking for the room.
Yeah, for all the cameras and for the Washington Post. He's a politic guy, relatively speaking, but I think he was genuinely self-reflective in these conversations. And there were others, too. Samantha Power also, does some hard thinking, I think, about the issue of the centralizing of power at the White House under Obama, and did they empower the agencies enough? There's a lot of soul-searching in this book. And when you talk to those officials, I think one thing that emerges is, yes, there's some acknowledgement that there was a real problem. And that's been true in a number of administrations, Republican and Democrat. Never to the extent that is happening now. What is happening now is a new extreme. But we've made some of the same mistakes before, and there's an acknowledgement that they were mistakes. And then there is also, in the Obama administration in particular, I think some pride in the fact that they did really redirect resources towards large-scale diplomatic endeavors in that second term. And you wound up in just a matter of a few years with the Iran deal, for all its controversies, definitely a substantive diplomatic accomplishment. The thaw in relations with Cuba, the Paris Climate Change Accord.
Well, also programs like the YALI program, the Young African Leaders program,
which I was involved in,
which is remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
But the funding's up this year, so who's going to advocate for things like that?
I barely even address the sort of the subplot of the soft power spending at the State Department. I really focus in on the kind of the hard diplomatic deals to get us out of conflicts.
Right.
But you're absolutely right to point out, I worked on some of those programs, and they're vital.
Right. But it started in the Clinton administration. This didn't start with President Trump, right? I mean, they started cutting State Department programs.
As I say, I think the right way to frame it is that it's a new extreme. And you see these headlines blaring now of, assault on the State Department, and usually the word unprecedented is in there. But actually, thankfully, there's a lot of precedent that we can look to and draw clear lessons from. So you're right about the Clinton administration. Right after the Cold War, James Carville comes in and says it's the economy's stupid, and there's this understandable for domestic political reasons turn inward and this reinvestment in priorities that were resonating more at the time. But one consequence of that is you had Warren Christopher up on the Hill sounding, honest to God, exactly like Rex Tillerson. I mean, Madeleine Albright and a bunch of other Clinton officials, try to pass the buck entirely to Jesse Helms and a Republican Congress. But if you look back at what Clinton administration officials were saying in the beginning, they were demanding deep cuts. And over the course of that decade, you wound up with a 30% slash to diplomacy and development spending, a bunch of closed embassies, two agencies on information and arms control that were folded back into the State Department, and their work was really downsized. This was a problem for us in the long run, because when 9/11 came around, we were not prepared on the diplomatic side.
I have to turn to your great coverage of Harvey Weinstein and the whole Me Too movement. Actually, I think you started all of it. And what I really want to ask you is, did you feel as brave as we all think you are? I mean, did it feel, I know you well enough to know it was the right thing to do, but did you feel brave? I mean, did you have to have security?
So first of all, as flattering as that is, I definitely, didn't start any movement. I had a very narrow band of responsibility, which was to report these stories as meticulously as possible. And, if you want to talk about the community organizing and the movement side of what's happening, Tarana Burke years ago, as we all know, started the Me Too hashtag, and, is someone that I work with and stay in close touch with, and who I admire. And of course, even in the context of this more recent resurgence of these ideals and this fight, it all goes back to these sources. You know that as a fellow journalist, like, we don't do anything without people being brave enough to tell their stories. And I did worry about their safety. The process of reporting this was largely about months and months of painstaking conversations where we turned over every pro and every con of going on background, going on the record, how to parse these stories, and all of the complex and intensely personal ramifications for people. What are their fathers going to think? What are their brothers and spouses going to think? What is life like when, upon being Googled, this is the one thing that comes up? Mm-hmm. If you're a prominent woman in that entertainment industry, what does it mean for your career if every room and every audition you walk into, that's the first thing? And if a lot of the people in the power structure that you're still going to have to deal with, maybe don't take kindly to the fact that you spoke truth to power in that way. Mm-hmm. And yes, as I was fortunate enough to expose in some of these stories, there was also an elaborate system designed to physically threaten people and intimidate them, and I think very likely fraudulently. That'll be a determination that's made over the course of a long series of legal proceedings, but induce people to give up information. And this was work being done by combat-trained former Mossad agents using false identities. And
didn't it seem absurd sometimes, like you were in a movie, not in real life?
It was a very wild set of circumstances, but I think that actually, it's telling that we all find it so colorful and exotic, because actually what I learned in the course of this reporting is, as much as it seems like a spy thriller, these are actually not uncommon tools employed by a very, very elite echelon of powerful and wealthy people. And I've run into a lot of the same intermediaries in the reporting I've done around this administration and secret election season payments, and these tactics of intimidating and silencing and suppressing stories are ones we should all know about. And I'm really grateful for the many, many brave reporters, not just me, who have gone up against this and really helped us understand what's happening.
I think the other thing that changed as a result of your reporting, Hilary and I were talking about it, that it used to be a woman could accuse, or anyone could accuse someone of, some sort of harassment, and if there wasn't another witness, an actual witness, that it wasn't, people, the reporters, people wouldn't actually believe them. But now, if there is someone contemporaneously that you spoke to, it just seems that the bar has moved more on, I don't want to say victim, but on the victim side. Do you think that's true?
Well, I hope that the bar remains extremely high, and certainly, in what we do at the New Yorker, it's incredibly high, and I think correctly one of the lessons of these stories that broke through from the Post and the Times, the New Yorker, is that they needed to be really bulletproof. And from my standpoint, I'm a lawyer by training, as you know, and these were like writing...
That was 15. All right, yeah.
These were like writing legal briefs, right. It really was about, not in the sense that they're polemic or argumentative, but in the sense that they really needed to account for every counter-argument. And they needed to interrogate every possible fact and really go through a rigorous discovery process so there were no surprises. And overall, I know there's a lot of conversation swirling around about, have things gone too far? But I think that while those questions are perfectly fair, on the whole, reporters have done an incredible job maintaining that high standard.
Well, to the question of have things gone too far, do you think they have?
You know, I would say in my view that in the cases where there's been miscarriages of journalism, or there have been consequences that don't seem to match the severity of the allegations, our profession has been fairly self-regulating. It's identified those cases and sort of called them out for what they are. You look at the reaction to the Aziz Ansari story.
Right.
People weren't running around saying that's the end of the world and we should crucify this guy. There was a sort of intelligent conversation about where the lines were in the set of incidences described in that anecdote, and there was a conversation about whether the journalism was strong enough. A single source account that had a lot of kind of opinion and color in it that stacked the deck, and people saw all of that for what it was.
What about, put your political analyst hat on, and what about Al Franken? I mean, is there a path back for Al Franken? Is that what is there language, path back?
Look, I've been asked this all the time, and it's honestly just not my job to speculate about paths back for anyone.
Okay.
I tell the
Maybe
stories,
someone here
and
will tell us that.
I try to tell the stories in a way that has staying power, and I only tell them if I think that they reach an incredibly high level of seriousness. And in that case, I think you owe it to all parties on all sides to really interrogate the claims as skeptically and rigorously as possible. The broader political questions of what happens in the long run and the comebacks and that's for pundits and media people and politicians.
Well, I read your sister's piece, and I've heard you talk about your sister, and I just wonder how hard it must be as you're reporting these stories that you had to deal with so much of this in your family, and you've been such a great support for your sister too. Doesn't that make this twice as hard to report on all of it, or is it the opposite?
It was adjacent to rather than directly involved in the reporting I was doing, adjacent to it in the sense that I had an understanding of the abuse of power, and I had an understanding of the high emotional stakes for every survivor who lives through this and grapples with decisions about whether to speak. And that was a lifeline of expertise. She was one of several people I was close to who had dealt with issues of sexual violence, who I would call, when I was dealing with a source who was, getting cold feet, or who, wanted a safe space to say something but wasn't sure how to say it. I would call people who I felt had been there.
Right.
And so my sister was invaluable in that respect. And also I think if you look at the broader landscape and how it's changed, this didn't just break all at once. You could feel over the course of the past year when this reporting was happening that it was almost overdetermined in a way, that multiple tributaries were flowing into this one reservoir. And that included the women who came forward about Bill Cosby and were terribly smeared as a result. The reaction was very different to what we're seeing now. It certainly, I think, included my sister, and it included Gretchen Carlson talking about the situation at Fox News. And these were all precedents that I pointed to as I tried to create a window into a world where these women who were brave enough to speak might actually be heard at the end of it. I wanted to convey that to them.
I've got to talk to you about this Russia story, Cambridge Analytica, and the bots and everything that's happening. Are you going to get into this? Do you have an opinion about it? Are you like us?
You should call Jane Mayer up here.
Well, you know what? Jane is trying to hide. She's trying to slink out right now. Well, I asked that, and she's here on deadline.
Jane and I are both on deadline.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's good that you're here. This is perfect because we can just stop you guys. But I mean, I just wonder.
You're stopping the news, Tammy.
Yes, I'm stopping the news. I am, but I know the New Yorker can handle it. But do you look at that story and think, boy, I want a piece of that, or I want to get into it, or are you just fascinated like we are?
Well, let me, because I have become...
Because it comes back to what your book's about.
Exactly,
And the
Tammy.
Chinese. I'm helping you out here.
Thank you for helping me sell my book. So I was going to do the same thing. We're both pros.
Yeah.
We know how to do this. One point that Rachel Maddow made about this book, which actually is touched on in the book, but I hadn't pulled out as prominent a theme as I think she considered it to be, is that it intersects with a lot of reporting we have about Jared Kushner's interactions with the Chinese and Donald Jr.'s interactions with the Russians. And one thing you see in some of those interactions is that in what should have been and would have conventionally been traditional diplomatic meetings, instead you actually have the diplomats and the experts kicked out of the room and not permitted access. And you have meetings happening, for instance, between Jared Kushner and the Chinese ambassador one-on-one. And what you see as we face a mounting body of evidence of an influence campaign targeting individuals in this administration, and mounting questions about collusion and so forth, these things you're asking about, we remove a layer of armor in the face of those criticisms when we deprofessionalize diplomacy. There is a reason you want adult professionals in the room and someone keeping an eye and someone preventing the other side from saying whatever they want about those meetings and from exerting undue influence in those meetings.
Well, Ronan, I want to thank you on behalf of the co-host, Franco Nuschese. Thank you for having us. Everything is wonderful.
Franco. Thank you, Kathy and Tammy and Hilary.
So fun.
And can I just say thank you to all the reporters who came for this. There are so many people I look up to in this room. Thank you for coming. It really means a lot. I have so much admiration for you guys.